All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Mark McClellan. I'm the director of the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy, and I'm very glad to be with you here today as part of Real World Evidence, the musical, now playing at the National Academy of Medicine. I was actually here earlier, too. I wasn't a ghost moderator during that session with Scott Gottlieb, which is that the current FDA commissioner definitely does not need a moderator. And I am glad that and Greg made a couple of good decisions about his musical design. One was not casting me in a singing role, and the second was Fiddler on the Roof. It's a good base for tradition and changes, but while still building on and recognizing why some traditions are there in the first place, like ones about valid evidence and solid research methods. But also, it's good that he didn't choose Groundhog Day, the musical. And I want to start off by emphasizing why this is not Groundhog Day, even though we've heard some comments today about, haven't we been here before with real world stuff? The world, in all seriousness, the world is different. Data from clinical and patient-generated sources are getting far richer than they used to be. Computational methods are getting better, but there's still some reasons for tradition around making sure we're paying due attention to the quality of the data and the quality of the methods and the appropriateness for which they're used. So with that in mind, I want to review some of the things that we discuss in a complementary effort going on now, supported by FDA and working with the National Academy of Medicine at Duke-Margolis. We had a workshop last week focusing on generating fit-for-purpose evidence as part of this overall effort to move forward effectively on the use of real-world evidence for regulatory purposes. And I just want to emphasize that that's the purpose here. There are complementary uses of real-world evidence, many that extend, and I'll come back to that at the end. But here is FDA has identified evidence generation as being an opportunity for learning much more that's relevant for FDA regulatory decisions, and then by extension from that better evidence for clinical practice and improving care, as Scott emphasized this morning. This is driven by some bipartisan, strong legislative support, really mandates for FDA to do more in this area. I would emphasize again that real-world evidence use is not new for FDA. FDA has an extensive and increasingly strong system for safety surveillance, for post-market monitoring systems, and even use of real-world evidence, good historical controls and the like in certain new drug applications in rare populations and for some conditions where there isn't a good treatment alternative and it's very hard to design a traditional clinical study. Congress has encouraged FDA to do more to establish a program for using real-world evidence to issue guidance and other requirements listed here. FDA, as Scott Gottlieb mentioned this morning, has already taken some important steps in this direction, like the recent real-world evidence for medical device framework, which I think has a lot of thoughtful analysis behind it and can be relevant to work in the pharmaceutical life cycle evidence development as well. And as part of this congressional push and the opportunities that exist here to do more, FDA has started a joint or extended a joint arrangement, cooperative agreement with us on real-world evidence. Refer you all to our website for more details on this, Duke-Margolis real-world evidence. It included a real-world evidence expert working group formed back in 2015, some prior workshop, a couple of prior workshops earlier this year, and a public workshop last week, which is what I'm going to focus on today, where we had some extensive discussion around kind of foundational issues for moving forward on real-world evidence for regulatory uses, and released and discussed a framework paper around the regulatory use of real-world evidence. This framework paper includes a framework that is intended to at least be a preliminary guide to the discussions about how real-world evidence can be used and what the priorities might be. You can see why this is very complementary to the work that the National Academy is doing. The discussions we're having today and tomorrow, I think, are fleshing out these issues in more detail. The goal here here is to not only describe what the current landscape is around real-world data and real-world evidence, a very important distinction that I'm going to come back to in just a minute, but also what can happen next to help improve the use of real-world evidence for regulatory applications. This is a collaborative effort, but we are looking for that to be a broad collaboration. So we encourage people to take a look at the paper. If you didn't see it and have time, take a look at the webcast from the event last week. And we'd very much appreciate comments, further thoughts from any of you about how to move this effort forward. So let me start, though, with some basics about what we mean by real-world data and real-world evidence. What we found in the preparation for our meeting was that there was a lot of confusion and uncertainty around these terms. I think we heard some of that in the discussion earlier today. Let me just be very clear. Real-world data and real-world evidence do not mean observational, okay? And real-world data and real-world evidence are not the same thing. Real-world data is really about provenance. It's data related to patient health status and the delivery of care that is routinely collected. So this is information that might come from clinical records. Increasingly, it's coming from patients themselves. It might come from insurance claims data. It's data that's part of the routine delivery of care. And the question is, how can we turn that into real-world evidence? That arrow is probably smaller and less prominent than it should be, because that process is a non-trivial one. And really what a lot of this whole effort, I think, is about is how do we make that connection? There are tons of data out there. There are going to be tons more. How do we turn it into evidence that can be used for different kinds of regulatory decisions and, outside of today's context, other uses as well? So real-world evidence is evidence derived from real-world data. Doesn't happen automatically. It takes work with turning the data into data that are actually understandable and have the properties they need for appropriate methods to be used. And then it takes application of research methods and in generating and using real-world data to develop evidence, randomization can absolutely be a big part of all of that. I mean, that's happening now. There are trials being done using real-world data connected through PCORnet, connected through Sentinel, connected through other activities undertaken by device manufacturers, through registries that are randomizing and that are applying some very thoughtful methods to the data being collected to have a better understanding of what's coming out of it. So real-world data to real-world evidence is really, I think, the heart of the issues that we should be dealing with here. And in the paper, we talked about a fit-for-purpose approach for real-world evidence. And this resonates with a lot of the discussion earlier today. Well, what matters for the application of real-world data and the development of real-world evidence? Well, the regulatory context. How is the expected real-world evidence intended to be used? Very different kinds of applications, say between a pivotal study for approval of a new drug or biologic versus changing a label or meeting a post-market safety consideration or extending a label to a new population. The clinical context matters too. That influences how feasible other types of evidence development might be. How rare is the condition? Is it possible to set up a traditional clinical trial? Is it easier, potentially more valuable to use real-world data approaches, registries and the like, to identify a relevant set of patients? Chronic versus acute. Are you trying to track a long-term outcome? Different kinds of dosing issues and what exactly is involved in the treatment and potentially the resulting claims. And then these feed into the issues around data and the issues around methods for analyzing the data and assuring the underlying, or at least understanding the quality and reliability of the underlying data. data. And here, again, there are many potential sources of data which may be more or less relevant to particular regulatory questions, and many different approaches to design, including randomization, but also prospective or retrospective approaches or observational approaches or something in between, cluster randomization and the like, which matter as well. So the paper presented a framework for putting this all together. What's the specific regulatory decision at stake? What kind of labeling issue or regulatory decision issue, and the clinical context. And with that in mind, that really determines what data and methods would be appropriate for generating real-world evidence that fits the regulatory purpose. Here, data considerations are very important. Missing data, understanding what data are missing, how reliable and consistent the data are, other quality assurance, data curation procedures, very important, and then methods considerations. Are the methods of sufficient rigor to address the question at hand? And again, we've had a lot of discussion of interventional or randomized versus observational, and again, there's no reason that randomization shouldn't. Hopefully it will much more be occurring in the context of real-world evidence development opportunities. There are also distinctions between prospectively well-specified, transparent analyses and those that are done retrospectively. Even within retrospective analysis, it makes a difference if you're able to specify methods in advance and use a data set that hasn't been investigated before using the same methods. All of these things contribute to the credibility of the results and contribute to the overall evidence available on the question. No one single real-world evidence study is going to be all the evidence that exists for most of these regulatory questions. And again, as Scott and FDA have emphasized all along, when they make regulatory decisions, they look at the totality of the evidence. And the question is how much and how effectively can real-world evidence contribute to that totality. So at our meeting back in September, we had some extensive discussion on these issues, including on data. I'd say that this is where really a lot of the discussion focused about the challenges in moving from the masses and growing availability of real-world data to data that can be understood well enough to be included and interpreted in a methodologic approach to generating real-world evidence on a regulatory purpose. Here, a big emphasis and a lot of support for trying to break down this distinction between, as Commissioner Gottlieb mentioned this morning, research that's occurring over here under certain idealized conditions, and good enough, sufficiently rigorous, fit-for-purpose data that could be part of real-world care systems and contribute to the evidence base. But a lot of concerns about making sure that data were of good provenance, that could be traceable back to sources if there are questions that arose. All of that, very important for the credibility of the real-world data. And we're not even to evidence yet. Bring in patient perspective has been challenging to do. Patient-generated data, directly patient-generated data in many traditional clinical trial contexts, but a lot of interest and support for bringing in more of the patient perspective, more patient-generated data as part of the real-world evidence process. And in talking to some of the people who have been at this for a while and trying to turn data, real-world data into real-world evidence, I don't think you can underestimate the importance of data governance and stewardship. It helps you make sure you understand where the data comes from, and make sure that there's support, both patient buy-in, provider buy-in, and so forth for use of the data. And it's important for overseeing stewardship to make sure that data are turning into something that really is understandable. Finally, we had some extensive discussion around innovative data platforms to help enable secure aggregation of patient data, so moving away from just a big data warehouse somewhere that people might increasingly worry could get hacked, to using techniques like blockchain. This is not an endorsement of that. There are other approaches too that could put together data when needed for reliable analysis. I just want to emphasize that the data, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to turn real-world data into data that's fit for purpose for many regulatory applications. Second, we had a big emphasis on methods, and taking robust primary data sources as a given, pairing this with appropriate methods for the regulatory question at hand was also an area for lots of comments and lots of discussion. In general, these are findings that I think people who are involved in statistical analysis and this whole area of evidence generation would view as good basic practices. So having transparent analytic plans, specifying them in advance, even if the data is itself already established. Making sure that any real-world evidence generation methods fit into the totality of evidence approach, as I mentioned before, and making sure that there is good enough quality data to address the endpoints and the conclusions that are intended with the methods analysis. And I want to emphasize here too that there's a strong support for doing randomization where possible, and kind of a strong interest in developing and taking forward methods that could make randomization both at the individual patient level, maybe even via smartphones, finding patient populations in new ways rather than having the trials be center-based, having them patient-based, and the like. A lot of interest in that, but also some real questions, and I think it reflects the discussion this morning about, well, when can you use non-randomized designs, observational methods? When are those appropriate for regulatory decisions? They're clearly being used a lot in safety questions. They're clearly being used outside of the FDA context in decisions about comparative effectiveness and cost effectiveness and the like. So how are those going to fit into, and can there be more clarity and work done to determine how those could fit into label extension studies and the like? Another theme emerging from this effort, and I'll wrap up in just a couple of minutes, keep us on schedule, is that having a clear path to regulatory acceptability for, again, fit-for-purpose data and methods for real-world evidence could be a big driver towards getting more robust and interpretable evidence from clinical systems and from patient-generated sources, data that patients are using to try to promote better health as well. This is potentially synergistic with the move towards new payment models that focus on value, that focus on endpoints like did the patient actually get better, not did the patient take a drug or not. That can help generate the same kind of support, the same kind of infrastructure and validation needed for these real-world evidence studies. It can also help support clinical decision support tools and again, fit back into regulatory decision making. But we need some further work here, and this is, I think, a challenge to the outside world, which is part of what today's meeting, tomorrow's meeting, the further work that the National Academy is going to be about, is what needs to happen, not just at FDA in terms of collaborative work to develop clear regulatory pathways for real-world evidence, but what needs to happen in the broader product developer, research, and stakeholder, patient, physician, provider, stakeholder community to make real-world evidence more routine and useful. To date, the practical uses, the reliable uses of real-world evidence are still limited relative to the volume of real-world data available and the growth trajectory of that data. And it's going to take some further investment by all of the stakeholders that I mentioned in terms of time, effort, and other resources to really advance the goals. And that is back to the purpose of the meeting today and our further work in this complementary Duke-Margolis effort, which is how can we build a much stronger foundation for the use of real-world evidence for regulatory purposes, and by extension, a much stronger infrastructure for real-world evidence development to improve clinical practice. Thank you all very much for the opportunity to provide this we got started a little late. We ended a little late. I think we have maybe a couple of minutes for questions or comments. Hopefully this was helpful in given the discussion this morning. Anybody? Everybody's ready for lunch? Want a different musical? Want Greg to sing again? Yeah, it's just please go up to the microphone when you've got a question.
Is it
either here or there.
possible to find your report by looking at the Duke-Margolis website?
Yes. Duke-Margolis, real world, Google Duke-Margolis real world evidence. Greg Daniel, I don't know, something on there. Rob.
That was a great summary. And not to belabor the point, but why do you think it's so hard for people to get that randomization and real world are not counter opposites? I mean, it's been amazing to me that this has been a point of emphasis for, it's like you're a basketball referee and you have a point of emphasis and the players just can't seem to get that they, what the point is.
Yeah, well,
so,
I think it's
and what should we do to get the message out? Because if there's confusion in a room of experts like this, imagine the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think that's right. And again, in our work on this framework paper for the Duke-Margolis project, we ended up putting much more emphasis on just these basic definitional issues than I had expected when we started the process. And I think it is incumbent on all of us as people who are close to these issues to be clear in our terminology. This is, look, anything that's new and different, as Fiddler on the Roof tells you, is going to be a bit controversial. It's easy to criticize some approaches to real world evidence if you take the caricature approach of messy data and no valid methods, but that's not what this is. And we need to, as a research and development community, try to be as clear as possible about what we mean with these definitions, and that's why we did the definitional effort for this framework paper. We're not saying we have it right. In fact, if you have comments on it, that'd be great to hear too. But at least at the key points that I tried to emphasize today, it would be good to know if there's kind of agreement, at least in this room, on that, and then maybe we can do a better job, as Rob said, of communicating with the broader public who really care about this stuff for understandable reasons about what we mean. Yeah.
Hi, Deborah Schomburg. I'm Vice President for Scientific Affairs at Evidera. Previous to that, and I'll give you a little introduction just because I think it's relevant for where I'm coming from. I was head of medical evidence at Shire, and before that had about a 20-year career at Harvard Medical School. I'm an epidemiologist by training, and I grew up with Charlie Hennekins in the Large Simple Trial Group and Paul Ridker in the Jupiter study, and so I have no problem believing that randomization is in the real-world data and real-world evidence space whatsoever. It's sort of the world I grew up in. But parallel to that, we had other studies like the Nurses' Health Study, for example. And with your definition, or the group's definition of real-world data derived from a study like that wouldn't necessarily fall under your definition, because a lot of the data collected are not data that are collected in routine clinical practice. And similar to that, if you start talking about use of technology and wearables and Twitter and social media data, those are also not routinely collected as part, and even patient-reported outcomes. So I have a little kind of question mark about the constrictiveness of the definition.
We certainly meant to include all of those sources, so maybe it's should be a more open definition that you have to have some routinely collected data, but additional data. And I actually would. I do think. Look at our team here, but I do think like Twitter feeds, information coming from your smartphone that you're tracking yourself, and absolutely is in. It's not just information from a clinical setting. We kind of need to get past the fact that in the future, hopefully, most of the data that we're relying on for regulatory decisions is going to come from sources other than just when people have encounters with the healthcare system. Although that is really important data. So all that should be part of this effort. It does raise a lot of data curation and methodologic questions that Paul Ridker and Charlie Hennekins were also very good at emphasizing too.
Yeah, and I guess I would say regulatory considerations are obviously a big part of it, but there's a whole other part of the picture, and we had panelists from the payer perspective and other things, and it's also the patients, right? And it's the people that we're trying to ultimately deliver the best,
yeah.
the best value to. So
Absolutely the goal, and I would just not view those. I would view those again as complementary. That I would feel more confident if a lot of the decisions that were taking place in clinical practice had been, could be actual claims about products rather than based off less clear and less rigorous, and at least less even transparent methods.
thank you.
So, Mark, have you thought all about who's going to pay for real-world evidence? The data warehouses that, I think what we've seen now is we can ingest a whole bunch of data.
Yeah.
But the question about how to improve the quality of that, to track provenance, all that stuff. The health systems, to some extent, they have a little bit of push to it, but it's not right in their wheelhouse. And the only other issue that I think sometimes happens with sponsor, when they hear real world evidence, they think, oh, it's cheaper.
Yeah.
That's why, that's our number one reason we're going to try, because it's very efficient, but in their view, cheaper. And I think somewhere we've got to start thinking about where's going to be the funding to take. I mean, we've done this. Most health system research, very, very few have any focus on data quality.
It's limited. I would say it's getting better, not worse. So not Groundhog Day, but starting to break out of those traditions. Many health insurance companies, at least if you believe their strategic goals, their long-term goal is to not just pay claims, but to be like the source of integrated data analytics to support better decisions for individual patients. So many of those companies are making big investments in data infrastructure and analytics infrastructure. It's highly relevant to this work too. Manufacturers, one of the reasons that Congress asked for FDA to develop a guidance in this area was to have more clarity. This was a big theme in our conference last week. What is appropriate clarity about claims that could be based on regulatory decisions. It could be based on real-world evidence. So to the extent that those pathways get cleared, there's going to be more investment. And hopefully with this shift towards focusing on outcomes in our payment rules and Medicare and private insurance support for healthcare providers, and be more emphasis on this as well. But I think it's a great topic for further discussion here, and as this whole work goes forward. I think there's time for one more question or comment. No, that's you. It's you. Yeah.
Thank you, Bruno Leroy, Sanofi. Thank you for this framework. There is something that I didn't see in your framework on slide 9. It's the health value produced. You alluded to in the conclusion, but seeing this through a regulatory lens sort of excludes all the health value produced, the hard outcomes, the population of interest, the cost, benefit, etc. And I wonder if, in fact, it should not be, in fact, a big part of the benefit of the real world
it's certainly development. A huge part. Yeah, it's certainly a huge part of real world evidence goals around, as we're just talking about, outcome based payments and the like. I think it actually challenged. I think it could be part of regulatory decisions too. I don't understand why we don't see more claims or have a clear pathway for more claims about cost effectiveness effects.
True, but by reintegrating perhaps regulatory
exactly. Exactly. And I think that should be part and parcel of the goals of this work, and would add a lot of value to the healthcare system too. So thank you all very much. I think we're breaking for lunch now. Right. Thank you.